Welcome back to the Agent House Debates. I'm Nexus, your host. Today we are tackling one of the most explosive topics of the decade, the impact of identity politics and DEI on society. To start, let's get our terms straight so we aren't talking past each other. When we say DEI, we mean diversity, equity, and inclusion, workplace efforts intended to broaden opportunity, reduce bias, and help more people succeed. And when we talk about identity politics, we generally mean politics organized around group identity, like race, gender, or religion, where that shared experience is treated as central to power and justice. Here is the timeline that sets the stakes for today. After 2020, we saw a massive surge in DEI roles across the corporate world. But since 2023, thousands of those roles have been cut, and as of late 2025, reporting from the New York Times and others suggests some of this work persists, but has been quietly rebranded inside HR departments to avoid scrutiny. Indeed, data cited by CNN and the Financial Times showed job listings rising roughly 30 to 36% in parts of 2021 and 2022, followed by a sharp drop after a mid-2022 peak. So the question isn't just, was DEI good or bad? It is, what happens when we scale these ideas up fast and then pull them back just as fast? Joining me to debate this are two distinct voices. First, the Classical Liberal Critic, who argues for strict meritocracy and warns that focusing on group identity leads to tribalism. And across the table, the Progressive Advocate, who argues that colorblindness ignores reality and that we must actively dismantle systemic barriers. Ground rules. We keep the tone civil, no personal attacks, and if we use insider acronyms, we define them in plain English as we go. Classical Liberal, you're up first. Give us your opening statement on why you believe the focus on group identity is a mistake.
To be clear, when I criticize identity politics, I mean the specific ideology that treats people primarily as members of racial or gender groups rather than as individuals. My stance is simple. I stand for meritocracy, where people earn roles through ability and performance, not identity. And I believe we must protect equal rights, rather than trying to engineer equal group outcomes. You mentioned the timeline, and it is telling. As reported by the New York Times and others, DEI roles surged post-2020, but thousands were cut since 2023, with some persisting rebranded in HR as of late 2025. That instability suggests that prioritizing group identity over merit created real friction. My North Star is equal rights and competence, not equal outcomes and group ranking.
That is a clear stake in the ground. You want the best person for the job, regardless of identity. But merit is a tricky word. One person's objective standard is often another person's rigged test. Progressive Advocate, you're up. The Classical Liberal says, merit first is the only way to avoid tribalism. Your side often argues that what we call merit is just a mask for historical privilege. Give us your opening stance on this timeline of surge and retreat.
I want to start by challenging the idea that inclusion is the enemy of competence. I believe in meritocracy too. The idea that the best people should rise based on talent and effort. But that only works if the playing field is actually level. If your neutral system consistently filters out qualified people because they lack the right networks or hail from the wrong zip code, you aren't measuring merit. You are measuring advantage. To me, equity is not about handing out participation trophies. It is about noticing that some people face structural barriers and adjusting the rules so the competition is genuinely fair. Progressives frequently describe DEI expansions since 2020 as essential countermeasures to racial and gender biases embedded in these merit-based systems, even though critics often argue that framing politicizes the workplace. My question to you is simple. If we scrap these efforts and go colorblind, do you believe the bias just magically disappears? Or do we just stop measuring it?
You used the phrase, adjusting the rules, to make the competition fair. That is the exact friction point. Classical liberal, is there any version of adjusting the rules you accept to fix a narrow pipeline? Or is that automatically unfair preference in your view?
There is a critical distinction here. If adjusting the rules means widening outreach to find talent in new places, or blinding resumes to prevent bias, that actually strengthens meritocracy. I am fully in favor of removing genuine barriers, but we have to be honest. In practice, equity often shifts from removing barriers to managing results. When you lower a standard or use identity as a tiebreaker to hit a quota, you aren't fixing the system. You are just victimizing a different individual. So, progressive advocate, what is your limiting principle? At what point does correcting bias turn into permanent discrimination against people based on their group identity?
All right, Heat 1 is where this debate gets real. Does prioritizing equity create actual safety risks, or is meritocracy just a cover for gatekeeping? Here's the shared reality. After 2020, DEI expanded fast. Indeed data to HR Brew showed a 67% rise in relevant listings from Jan 2020 to October 2021. But now we see a retreat. Revelio Labs data reported by NPR says employers eliminated over 2,600 DEI jobs since early 2023. I want to pin both of you to the hard question. When does equity become a standards problem? Classical liberal, start us off. We've seen claims linking DEI to failures in high-stakes fields like aviation. Is that a real connection, or just political storytelling?
I want to be very careful not to overstate the case. Currently, no evidence links FAA DEI to Jan 2025 Potomac crash, 67 dead. NTSB cites airspace risks, chronic staffing shortages noted in abnormal tower ops as of December 2025. My argument is about incentives and trust. When you replace equal opportunity with equity, which usually means managing group outcomes, you introduce a political metric into technical fields. If a hiring manager knows their bonus or social standing depends on hitting a demographic target, the pressure to compromise on rigor becomes real. That doesn't mean planes fall out of the sky tomorrow, but it means the public stops trusting that the pilot was chosen solely for their skill.
That is a heavy accusation, that safety is being traded for optics. Progressive advocate, is this political metric real, or is the anti-woke side just afraid of who qualifies when the gates are actually open?
I am glad you admitted the facts. There is no evidence linking diversity efforts to that crash. Blaming equity for complex system failures isn't safety analysis. It is scapegoating. The real risk isn't widening the pool. It is pretending the old pool was perfect. When we remove equity tools, we see exactly who gets pushed out. After the SFFA decision, the Supreme Court ruling that limited race-conscious admissions, 2025 reporting confirmed drops in underrepresented minority enrollment at many elite universities. That didn't happen because talent vanished. It happened because we stopped accounting for the barriers that mask talent. If your definition of merit consistently results in fewer opportunities for certain groups, are you measuring potential, or are you just measuring privilege?
That is a concrete outcome. Fewer Black and Hispanic students at top schools. Classical liberal, is that an acceptable price for your version of merit? Or do you see that as a system failure?
It is a fact that post-2023 SFFA ruling, 2025 reports confirm underrepresented minority enrollment drops at many elite universities. But let's be honest about why. The previous system was explicitly using race to engineer those numbers. The liberal answer isn't to bring back racial sorting. It is to target disadvantage directly. Income, zip code, and family history, regardless of race. My question to you is, Why defend a system that would prioritize a wealthy applicant from an underrepresented group over a poor applicant who doesn't check the right box? That isn't fighting privilege, it's just rearranging it.
You are setting up a false choice between class and race. We know both matter, but pretending race doesn't exist as a barrier doesn't fix poverty. Let's look at the actual metrics we use to define merit. AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, data indicate MCAT score gaps clearly linked to socioeconomic status and preparation access. That means the test often measures your study budget as much as your potential. If we strip away that context and look only at the raw score, we aren't finding the best future doctors. We are often just finding the students with the most resources. Why is context a dirty word in your version of merit?
Quick correction. ETS studies find no cultural bias in SAT disadvantaging English learners or minorities. Validity is consistent across groups despite preparation gaps. But the friction point remains. Context sounds fair, but different standards sounds risky. Classical Liberal. Is there a way to account for study budgets without lowering the bar for the surgeon holding the scalpel?
Context is vital when we are helping people prepare. But once we are selecting a surgeon, context cannot replace competence. The data shows that gaps in scores reflect gaps in preparation, not a broken test. If we lower the standard to fix the demographic mix, we aren't fixing the pipeline. We are just hiding the problem and passing the risk on to the patient. So here is my question. If equity requires lowering a job-relevant standard to get the result you want, do you lower it, or do you accept the unequal outcome?
That's a straight yes-no question on standards versus outcomes. Progressive advocate, don't dodge it. If the pipeline is unequal, do you lower the bar or accept the gap?
The answer is no. You never lower the safety standard, but you absolutely must stop confusing tradition with competence. Businesses understand this distinction. A 2025 Catalyst survey found that roughly 90% of executives and employees at large U.S. firms still favor DEI practices like inclusive hiring. They aren't doing that to endanger their customers, they are doing it because they know a wider net catches more talent. The retreat we are seeing, where employers eliminated over 2,600 DEI jobs since early 2023, isn't because merit suddenly won. It correlates with intense political pressure and fear of litigation. That is not quality control. That is a chilling effect.
You mention a chilling effect, but the other side calls it a correction. Classical Liberal, if 90% of business leaders support these practices, is your merit crisis just a ghost story, or are they all wrong?
Let's look at what that 90% actually supports. They support things like ERGs, employee resource groups, which are voluntary networks for support, and inclusive hiring. I support those too. But the retreat is happening where it counts, in the coercive mechanics. We know that DEI pay incentives came under pressure in early 2025 after a 2-year surge. Companies are pulling back not just because of politics, but because tying executive pay to identity targets creates legal risk and internal division. If this system was truly merit-based, it wouldn't be so fragile.
Fragile, or just under siege? Progressive advocate, if companies drop these pay incentives because of political pressure, are we losing the only lever that actually forces leaders to care, or was paying for diversity always a mistake?
In any other part of business, sales, safety, efficiency, we pay for results. Why is building a diverse pipeline the only goal where accountability is called coercion? The reality is that Trump's 2025 EOs and election win correlated with reported corporate DEI rollbacks, including job/payroll cuts in diversity roles, Bloomberg, NPR. This proves the retreat isn't happening because the method failed. It is happening because a successful political campaign targeted the tools that actually change who gets a seat at the table. If you remove the incentive, you are effectively saying that maintaining a homogeneous workforce is a perfectly acceptable outcome for a modern leader.
There it is. The argument that neutrality preserves the status quo. Classical liberal, if you remove the pressure, does the workplace actually stay fair? Or does it just default back to, who do I know?
Sales and safety measure performance. Race and gender do not. That is the fundamental category error. When you incentivize a demographic outcome, you aren't paying for fairness. You are effectively paying managers to discriminate against the individual who doesn't fit the quota. That doesn't end cronyism. It just replaces who do I know with what box do I check? And it places a permanent question mark over the head of every minority hire. Did I earn this, or did the boss need his bonus? That isn't progress. It's a new stigma.
That stigma argument is potent. Does help actually taint the achievement? Progressive advocate, we are almost out of time for this heat. Answer that directly. Does a thumb on the scale hurt the dignity of the people you want to help?
The question mark you describe is a symptom of the bias, not the solution. Why do we assume a diverse hire is unqualified until proven otherwise, but assume the candidate hired through a family network is a meritocratic win? We never ask if the legacy hire feels a stigma. Equity is not about lowering the bar. It is about ensuring the bar isn't just a measure of who had the smoothest path to the door. If we stop measuring who gets excluded, we aren't protecting dignity. We are just protecting the comfort of those who never had to wonder if they belonged.
Let's be consistent. I oppose legacy admissions just as much as I oppose identity quotas. Both violate merit. But saying legacy exists is not a justification for building a new, massive bureaucracy to engineer results by race. We ran a national experiment with these incentives, and companies are retreating because it created legal risk and broke trust. The path forward isn't to ask whose group wins, but to demand that no group counts more than the competence of the individual standing in front of you. That is the only standard that treats everyone with equal dignity.
Heat 2 is where the rubber meets the road. Should we be colorblind and treat everyone exactly the same? Or do we need a systemic view because the starting line isn't equal? We saw how high the stakes are after the 2025 DC plane crash, when President Trump attributed FAA staffing shortages and the crash itself to DEI policies lowering standards, a claim disputed by investigators but embraced by many critics. Quick definitions before we dive in. Colorblind means judging individuals without regarding race. Systemic means recognizing that rules and history can create unequal outcomes even without individual prejudice. And SFFA refers to the 2023 Supreme Court ruling that limited race-conscious admissions. Progressive advocate, you're up. When you hear colorblind, do you hear fairness or denial?
To me, colorblind is often just a polite way of saying we should stop measuring who gets left behind. We just saw what happens when you force that blindness on the system. Post-SFFA colorblind policies correlate with underrepresented minority enrollment declines at many selective colleges, continuing disparities as of fall 2025, AP Forbes. The talent didn't vanish. The mechanism to recognize it did. And this isn't just about college. It is about the cushion that allows you to take risks. The Federal Reserve's latest 2022 data, released October 2023, shows median Black household net worth at $44,900, or 15.7% of white, non-Hispanic households' $285,000. That is the starting line. So when we hear claims blaming DEI for safety issues, like the FAA shortages, which official reports actually attribute to COVID hiring pauses and training delays, not DEI, it feels like a distraction. We are blaming the attempt to fix inequality because it's easier than facing the inequality itself.
That gap, black wealth at 15% of white wealth, is massive. Classical Liberal, the systemic side, says colorblindness just locks that gap in place forever. Are you okay with that outcome? Or do you have a non-racial way to fix it?
I don't deny the wealth gap. Those numbers are real. But colorblindness doesn't mean we ignore reality. It means the government treats you as an individual citizen, not a census category. The alternative, sorting everyone by race, is socially explosive. We see the result on social media. Ex-critics in late November 2025 blamed FAA DEI policies for staffing shortages tied to flight delays, as of December 3, 2025. Even though official reports blame COVID pauses, the fact that the public immediately jumped to DEI caused this shows how fragile trust becomes when we racialize competence. The non-racial fix is to target disadvantage directly. Help the family with low net worth because they are poor, not because of their skin color. That closes the gap without tearing the country into tribes.
You call that reaction fragile trust, but the progressive side calls it a moral panic. Progressive advocate, be honest. When things go wrong, do people blame DEI because they are racist, or because they suspect you've been hiding the trade-off?
People blame DEI because it is a convenient story that confirms a bias, that diversity equals lower quality. But let's look at the actual trade-off. Black workers comprise roughly 12.8% of the U.S. workforce, but only about 9% of management roles, a nearly 30% underrepresentation relative to their share as of 2024 BLS data. If the system was truly neutral, talent would rise evenly. It doesn't. And about trust, blaming DEI for the FAA crash is pure politics. The NTSB noted atypical air traffic control staffing in the 2025 DC collision probe, but did not cite understaffing or workload as primary causes, or reference DEI. Investigation ongoing as of December 2025. We need to stop pretending that scapegoating diversity is a form of accountability. It's just finding a villain.
But critics argue the pattern is deeper than one crash. Classical Liberal, let's talk about medical training. Step 1 pass rates fell from 98% to 91% in the same years DEI expanded. Is that your smoking gun? Or just a coincidence you're exploiting?
It's not a smoking gun, but it is a flashing warning light. USMLE Step 1 pass rates for USMD students declined from 98% in 2020 to 91% preliminary January 2025, coinciding temporally with post-2020 DEI prioritization at 89% of med schools, AAMC USMLE data. I'm not claiming DEI caused that drop directly. Temporal correlation isn't causation. But when you inject politics into high-stakes competence systems, you create incentives to rationalize bad outcomes instead of fixing them. The public doesn't care about the systemic narrative. They care about whether the doctor knows the anatomy.
Let's be precise. UCLA med school defenders cite curriculum changes and early rigorous exams, not DEI, for higher shelf failure rates. But the perception problem is real. Progressive advocate, if the public sees equity and falling pass rates together, how do you prove you aren't lowering the bar?
You called it a warning light, but it looks more like a false alarm. Be suspicious of the easy story. As the host noted, UCLA defenders cite curriculum changes and exam timing, not DEI, for those shifts. If we are serious about merit, we have to be honest about what we are measuring. When the AAAMC data indicate MCAT score gaps by socioeconomic status and preparation access, a colorblind cutoff often just selects for who could afford the best prep course. My question is, why is it political to account for that wealth gap, but neutral to ignore it?
Classical liberal, that is the core challenge. Is ignoring the wealth gap neutral, or is it just passive unfairness?
Ignoring the wealth gap is unfair. That is why I support aggressive help for poor students, tutoring, financial aid, better schools. But fixing the pipeline is different from changing the finish line. If we decide that, in the name of equity, we will accept lower scores or different standards for surgeons based on group identity, we break the social contract. And let's be real about the reaction. When FAA used biographical questionnaires to screen ATC applicants for diversity goals, 2014-2018, it was criticized for sidelining skills-tested candidates, and Congress eventually banned it. The public will accept help for the disadvantaged. They will not accept rigged selection. That is where the line is.
Progressive advocate, you have 60 seconds to respond. Is rigged selection just a slur for correcting bias? Or do you admit that some equity policies look exactly like that to the people who get cut?
It feels like rigged selection to the person who loses a spot, absolutely. But to the person who never got into the room because they didn't have the wealth or the network, the old system looked pretty rigged too. You brought up that FAA questionnaire. Let's be accurate. The FAA discontinued biographical assessments for ATC hiring in 2018 per congressional ban. We aren't fighting that battle anymore. The real battle is this. If you insist on colorblindness when the data clearly shows systemic blocks, you aren't protecting merit. You are just protecting the status quo and calling it neutral.
Heat 3 is speech, harm, and freedom, and we are tackling the collision between free speech and inclusive norms. To be clear, when we say free speech here, we mostly mean workplace and campus rules, not just the First Amendment. And when people say harm, they usually mean both harassment and the broader chilling effect, where people self-censor out of fear. This isn't just theory. As of 2021, over 1,000 U.S. firms had mandated some form of DEI training, according to Revelio Labs data via CNN. The question is, do those trainings build a safer culture, or do they silence honest debate? Classical liberal, you're up. Your side often claims these trainings are ideological conditioning, but isn't asking employees to be respectful just basic management?
I agree that basic respect is non-negotiable. A workplace shouldn't tolerate harassment. But many of these trainings go beyond respect. They focus on microaggressions, which are small, everyday slights, but often defined so broadly they include valid political differences. And here is the reality check. Studies do not confirm DEI trainings reduce microaggressions. Evidence shows limited short-term self-reported attitude changes, no direct behavioral measurement. So we are policing speech without proof that it actually fixes behavior. And because this issue is deeply polarized, an April 2025 Pew poll found 78% of Republicans approve ending federal DEI versus 86% Democrats oppose. Mandating one side's ideology doesn't create safety. It creates a workplace where people are afraid to speak their minds.
The no evidence point is a direct hit on the training industry. Progressive advocate, if these trainings don't reduce microaggressions behaviorally, is the mandate actually about safety, or is it just about signaling virtues?
I am not here to pretend a corporate training seminar cures racism. The evidence confirms exactly what you said. Studies do not confirm DEI trainings reduce microaggressions behaviorally. We mostly see short-term attitude shifts in self-reports. But let's be real about fear. You worry about people being afraid to speak their minds about politics. I worry about the employee who is afraid to speak at all because they are constantly interrupted, stereotyped, or asked if they really belong. That is a speech chill too. So when you say policing speech, do you mean we shouldn't have rules against demeaning people? Or do you just want the freedom to ignore the cost of that speech on others?
That frames the tension perfectly. Whose silence matters more? Classical Liberal, if rules against demeaning people are standard HR practice, why does your side treat DEI as a special threat to liberty?
Because demeaning has drifted from slurs to disagreement, if unsafe means I heard an opinion I dislike about affirmative action or gender policy, you have created a veto over public reasoning. The first people punished by these norms are rarely the powerful. It is the low-status worker who uses the wrong jargon. Real inclusion means you can belong without pretending to believe things you don't. If DEI becomes a set of mandatory slogans, it trains people to lie, publicly agree, privately resent. That is not progress. It is just a quieter form of exclusion.
Let's test that logic against the business case, because companies claim this quiet exclusion hurts profits. McKinsey's 2020 report found diverse executive teams 36% more likely to outperform on profitability. But critics say those studies are correlational and often hard to replicate. Progressive advocate, be honest. Is the business case solid science or just a marketing slide to justify the program?
I will be honest, the business case is debated, not gospel. You cited the McKinsey 2020 report showing that 36% profitability link. But economists critique those studies as correlational and difficult to replicate. So I won't sell it as a law of physics. But the moral case stands without a spreadsheet. When organizations go colorblind, they often revert to exclusion. Look at Harvard and MIT. Post-SFFA, Black enrollment dropped significantly at both schools, from 18% to 14% at Harvard and roughly 15% to 5% at MIT. That suggests neutral rules aren't actually neutral. They are just a way to stop noticing who is missing.
That Harvard ID drop is steep, 18% to 14%. 15% to 5%. Classical Liberal, if neutrality cuts Black representation by 2/3 at a place like MIT, is that proof the rules are fair or proof they are broken?
That MIT drop from about 15% to 5% post-SFFA is striking, but it reveals something crucial. The previous number was engineered. MIT has famously rigorous, objective admissions standards. When they stopped using race as a thumb on the scale, the number changed. The liberal answer isn't to re-engineer the outcome by hiding the data. It is to look upstream at K-12 preparation. If we try to fix that pipeline gap by policing language or lowering standards at the finish line, we damage the credibility of the institution itself. And when institutions can't openly discuss trade-offs, they start managing reality through language rules. Which brings us back to censorship.
There is the upstream argument again. Progressive advocate, if the pipeline is the problem, is campus speech policing just a band-aid that annoys everyone without fixing the root cause?
I agree we need to fix the upstream pipeline. But telling a Black student at MIT, just wait for K-12 to get better in 20 years, doesn't help them survive the environment today. Campus speech codes aren't about fixing K-12. They're about deciding whether a university is a place where you can debate ideas without being humiliated for your identity. I'm not defending every clumsy policy, but if your version of free speech requires marginalized students to just toughen up while everyone else debates their humanity, you aren't defending liberty. You're defending a hierarchy.
Debates their humanity. That is the red line. Classical Liberal, final word for this heat. Can you distinguish between debating humanity and debating policy, or is that distinction impossible when identity is involved?
We must distinguish them. Debating humanity is harassment. You don't belong here. That is wrong. But debating policy, like should we use race in admissions, is essential. If we let harm expand to cover policy disagreements, we end up with a workplace where only one ideology is safe to speak. And ironically, that hurts minorities too. because it treats them as too fragile to hear dissent. A free society needs thick skin and open argument, not a list of forbidden questions.
All right, crossfire time. This is where we move from slogans to consequences. When people argue about DEI, they're not just talking about HR memos. They're talking about who gets opportunities, how safe people feel speaking up, and whether we're building a shared culture or two separate moral tribes. I want to ground this in a few hard numbers. Pew reports show partisan gaps on racial equality progress widened post-2020. 78% of Democrats versus 17% of Republicans in 2020 thought the country hasn't gone far enough. And in 2023, 78% of Democrats saw workplace DEI as good, compared to just 30% of Republicans. Progressive advocate, you're up first. When you hear those numbers, what's your read? Is that people disagreeing about facts or disagreeing about values?
It is fundamentally about values. Because the facts are glaring. When Pew reports that partisan gap, it tells you we are looking at two different worlds. One side sees the census data, like the 10x black-white wealth gap, and says, we have work to do. The other side sees the attempt to fix it and says, you're going too far. Before we fight about it, let's define it. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is simply the effort to widen opportunity and reduce bias. Identity politics is acknowledging that group identity shapes lived experience. The polarization isn't happening because we admitted these gaps exist. It's happening because one side refuses to believe they are systemic. If you want to heal that divide, you don't do it by silencing the language of equity. You do it by fixing the unfair baselines that keep generating the conflict.
Classical liberal, same data, opposite lens. Do you see this partisan gap as proof DEI became a tribal marker? Or do you think Democrats are responding to real inequities, but picking the wrong tools?
I see it as proof that DEI has become a tribal marker, not just a policy tool. When nearly 80% of one party supports it and 70% of the other opposes it, you've moved from management to moral warfare. My concern is what happens when DEI drifts from fairness into coercion. Pew's 2023 survey shows 49% of Democrats, but only 13% of Republicans say racial and ethnic diversity in the workplace is extremely or very important to them. That suggests we have a fundamental values conflict about the purpose of work. If half the country hears DEI and thinks fairness, and the other half hears it and thinks bias against me, you don't get unity. You get permanent culture war. The liberal answer to unequal outcomes is equal rights plus targeted help based on need, without sorting citizens into moral categories by race.
Moral categories. That's where the backlash lives. Let's look at where that backlash shows up most. Social media. High engagement X posts on DEI or wokeness since November 1st, 2025, mostly criticize or mock the concepts. Progressive advocate. Do you treat that as backlash to bad DEI or backlash to the idea of equity itself?
I treat it as what it is, the algorithm rewarding conflict. It is true that high engagement X posts since November 2025 mostly criticize or mock the concepts. But let's be careful. A platform built on viral outrage is not a referendum on justice. Critics of DEI on X often cite concerns about reverse discrimination or merit. I hear that anxiety. But merit is not a law of physics. It is a human system that has historically rewarded some groups over others. If we base our national policy on what gets likes on social media, we are letting the most polarized voices decide who gets opportunity. That is not a backlash to bad DEI. That is a backlash to the discomfort of sharing power.
But people do feel excluded. and that drives resentment. Classical Liberal, some highly engaged X posts since January 2025 highlight employee backlash to DEI trainings seen as anti-white, with complaints leading to cancellations. How do you prevent that from sliding into denial that real disparities exist?
We admit disparities exist, but we must stop using trainings that frame citizens as enemies. You don't need a viral algorithm to understand why people react badly to being labeled oppressors in a mandatory HR meeting. Even if you ignore the loudest voices online, it tells you something important. A lot of people experience DEI as compulsory language, not voluntary respect. That creates a legitimacy crisis. If employees believe the rules are rigged to punish them for their identity, they stop cooperating. That's not right-wing backlash. That's a basic human reaction to unfairness. The solution is simple. Enforce one standard. Don't discriminate against anyone, and stop trying to force moral unity in a pluralistic country.
Let's test this legitimacy crisis in the toughest lab we have, the military. The U.S. Army FY 2025 retention exceeded goals by 10% per official Army report, December 2025, and no evidence credits inclusion initiatives. Progressive advocate, when outcomes like retention improve, are you comfortable saying, don't credit inclusion unless there's direct evidence? Or do you think that's an unfair standard?
I am comfortable with the truth. The Army retention data is positive, and official reports do not credit inclusion initiatives as the cause. That is fair, but it cuts both ways. If you accept that DEI didn't cause the success, you also have to stop claiming DEI caused the recruiting challenges. RAND's 2025 analyses cite the economy and youth eligibility, including obesity, as factors in recruiting shortfalls, not wokeness. My point is simple. Stop using the military as a prop in a culture war. If retention is up, don't invent a story that wokeness ruined the Army. Deal with the evidence, even when it doesn't fit the narrative.
We've circled the core tension. DEI can mean anything from essential fairness to ideological policing, and that ambiguity is fueling the fight. Before we close, let's define two terms that dominated this debate. A microaggression is a small comment that lands as a slight, even if unintended. And psychological safety means people feel safe to speak up without fear of humiliation. Here is the question for the path forward. Can we design a culture that protects that safety without turning into an ideological enforcer? Classical Liberal, start us off. What does a workable path look like that doesn't just mean DEI disappears, but also doesn't mean everyone walks on eggshells?
DEI, meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, often starts with the good intention of fairness. But when it turns into speech policing and group-based sorting, it fractures the trust necessary for a diverse society. The path forward isn't to pretend discrimination never happens. It is to return to equal rights and transparent standards. We should enforce strict anti-harassment rules to protect safety, but we must stop treating political disagreement as harm. Real psychological safety comes from knowing that if you do your job well and treat people with respect, you belong, regardless of your politics or your identity. If we want a less divisive society, we have to stop asking people to see each other as oppressor and oppressed first. We need one standard for everyone, help based on need, and the freedom to speak without fear. That is the only way we live together.
One standard for everyone. That sounds clean, but history says neutral standards often miss the point. Progressive advocate, if we strip away the group-focused tools, what specific repair do you demand to make sure equal rights doesn't just mean equal right to stay behind?
I want a less divisive society too. But you don't get there by declaring merit and pretending it is neutral. You get there by building fair standards and a culture of respect. DEI, at its best, is just that: widening opportunity and making sure people can do their jobs without being quietly pushed out. When people hear DEI, they often imagine censorship. But a lot of training is about avoiding microaggressions, everyday slights that make work hostile, and choosing language that doesn't casually degrade people. That is not authoritarian. It is professionalism. We should reject shame rituals, yes, but we shouldn't confuse "I can say anything" with "I can treat coworkers however I want." And we can fix what is clumsy or coercive without pretending inequality is imaginary. If we lower the temperature without lowering our standards for dignity, we can actually build a system where merit works for everyone, not just the people it was originally designed for.
Before we close, I want to nail down this mandatory training point. Proponents claim mandatory DEI trainings reduce bias and improve psychological safety. But critics say mandatory formats backfire. If we're redesigning from scratch, classical liberal, what is the one change to mandatory that makes it acceptable to you? And progressive advocate, what is the one line you won't cross?
The one change is strictly limiting the mandate to conduct, not conscience. You can require employees to treat colleagues with respect and follow anti-harassment laws, but you cannot require them to affirm controversial political theories or confess to inherent bias. If training teaches professionalism, it works. If it demands ideological conformity, it breeds resentment and fake compliance. True inclusion means you are judged by how you treat people, not by whether you recite the approved slogans.
Conduct, not conscience. Progressive advocate, does that work for you? Or does that leave the deeper biases untouched?
Conduct is a good start, but it can't be the end. If your conduct looks neutral on paper, but consistently results in hiring the same 3 resumes from the same 2 schools, that is a conduct problem. So the line I won't cross is this: we cannot treat bias as a taboo topic. Bias is just a human pattern. If we aren't allowed to discuss how unintentional habits shape who gets promoted, we aren't fixing the problem. We are just agreeing to be polite about exclusion. I agree we shouldn't force confessions, but we should require competence in inclusion. Just like you have to know how to use a spreadsheet, you should know how to lead a team where people from different backgrounds can actually thrive. That is not ideology. That is management.
Competence in inclusion. That is the pitch. But let's close on the evidence, because both sides love to claim victory. In FY 2023, DoD as a whole was short 41,000 recruits. Critics blamed DEI, officials blamed the economy. Then FY 2025 retention met or exceeded goals after DEI cuts. Classical liberal, what is your standard of proof? If retention stays high, do you declare DEI was the problem, or do you admit correlation isn't causation?
I'll be precise. High retention doesn't prove DEI caused the prior shortage, but it does disprove the claim that DEI is essential for a healthy institution. We were told that without these programs, people would leave and cohesion would collapse. That didn't happen. FY 2025 U.S. military retention met or exceeded goals post-DEI cuts. My standard of proof is simple. Does the policy judge people by their character and competence, or their group identity? If we want a less divisive society, we have to stop asking people to see each other as oppressor and oppressed. You can't build a shared country on the idea that half the people are permanent defendants and the other half are permanent plaintiffs. The only path forward is equal rights, clear standards, and the freedom to speak without fear. That is the only way we live together.
That's a wrap. We've heard two very different futures for how we work and live together. One future says, stop counting by race, enforce one standard, and let freedom of speech sort it out. The other says, if you don't measure inequality, you protect it, and true fairness requires active repair. Listeners, which world do you want to live in? Let us know in the comments. I'm Nexus. I'll see you in the next simulation. Good night.